Now we all know William Lane Craig loves the Kalam Cosmological Argument. The weird line of reasoning that claims to deduce its way to knowledge about the origin of the universe like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. Now, of course, this is nonsense. When, or if, we actually learn anything about the origin of the universe, it will almost certainly be through evidence-based scientific exploration of space-time bending phenomena that lie outside our intuition and far beyond the frontiers of current knowledge. Not through armchair deductions based on our most quaint, localized eyeball observations of cause and effect. And when you compare it to how we really learn anything meaningful about the workings of the world around us, the Kalam is laughable. Nothing more than an exercise in leading a friendly audience to a pre-desired conclusion on a topic where the speaker found sufficient room for speculation. But I'm not here to unpack this syllogism itself. It's already been addressed so exhaustively by so many other people that I don't see belaboring it right now. Instead, what I want to take a look at is Craig's attempt to actually, connect this argument to God. Because as many have already pointed out, this isn't an argument for God at all. Even if you grant its premises, all it leads you to is a spectacularly unimpressive conclusion that the universe has some cause to its existence. Which, good for you. You've narrowed the cause of the universe down to something. The only reason anybody hears this as an argument for God is that they showed up with him already in mind, which basically sums up what apologetics is actually about in the first place. So when you have an apologist who started out seeking to get to a pre-desired conclusion about God, presenting to an audience who's just sitting there waiting for him to get to a pre-desired conclusion about God, the function of something like the Kalam is almost ceremonial. It provides just enough elaborate wordplay and apparent logical steps to give the feeling that the speaker is getting somewhere. And since God's the anticipated end of this journey, the audience mistakes all perceived progress as leading toward him, even if the apologist is only arguing toward a cause. So once he's gotten that far, the apologist really doesn't have to do much more than let the audience assume the cause is God. And any explicit argument for God that is made can be rushed through as if just explicitly summing up what's already been made obvious. That's why Craig is famous for this argument that doesn't even have anything to do with God, while the argument he uses to get from a cause to God languishes in relative obscurity. And this is a good thing for Craig, because the second one is nothing more than a moronically bald-faced non sequitur that lacks even the Kalam's misleading appearance of logical coherence. Yet despite the fact that it's less known than the Kalam and feels almost like a 45-second throwaway footnote, it's actually the linchpin of Craig's entire argument. So it's worth attacking head-on instead of letting apologists slip it under the radar while pretending the Kalam is doing more than it is. I know that was a lot of preliminary context, but a huge part of understanding this argument is in seeing how and why it's deployed within the big picture. In its entirety, it goes like this.
There must have been a cause which brought the universe into being. Now, as the cause of space and time, this being must be an uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial being of unfathomable power. Moreover, it must be personal as well. Why? Because the cause must be beyond space and time. Therefore, it cannot be physical or material. Now, there are only two kinds of things that fit that description. Either an abstract object, like numbers, or else a personal mind. But abstract objects can't cause anything. Therefore, it follows that the cause of the universe is a transcendent, intelligent mind.
Now, I've already played this in other videos, but I typically brush it off as evident nonsense. This is a fair thing to do, and I think we all intuitively get how dumb it is. However, he rushes us through so much verbiage that I thought it might be worth finally dissecting exactly what he's doing here. So let's start by breaking down his first contention.
There must have been a cause which brought the universe into being. Now, as the cause of space and time, this being must be an uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial being of unfathomable power.
So after reiterating the Kalam's conclusion that the universe must have a cause, he very quickly gets down to the business of describing the attributes of this cause. He says that it must be uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and possessing of unfathomable power. Notice also that he calls the cause a being, a word that connotes a conscious agent. I don't think this was an accident. This entire script is parsimonious and skillfully crafted, without a single wasted or even casually chosen word. And I have no doubt his selection of the word being here was used to build a suggestion of God into the very framing of the problem. If this were about serious open-ended inquiry, a better choice of word would be something like phenomena, which leaves you prepared to consider many more possibilities. This might sound like nitpicking, but swap these words back and forth in other questions, and it becomes clear what a big difference it makes. For example, questions like, what phenomena causes lightning, or what phenomena causes trees to lose their leaves, sound like the start to serious scientific inquiry that, with careful methodology and observation, might lead to meaningful answers. However, what being causes lightning, or what being causes trees to lose their leaves, is an entirely different kind of question that's almost certainly going to derail scientific inquiry from the start, regardless of whether the person is setting out with deliberate preconceptions. The same goes for what being caused the beginning of the universe, which is the implicit question Craig's trying to answer through deduction. Even setting aside whether Craig picked this word on purpose, though I'm pretty sure he did, its use corrupts even the modest progress that might be made trying to determine the cause of the universe through armchair reasoning. It helps the audience turn a blind eye to all the many other deeply unintuitive possibilities that might be evoked by the word phenomena. You know, stuff related to theoretical space-time or whatever that's way over my head. These are the kinds of much more scientific explanations that not only are clear possibilities in this case, but throughout history have always ended up being the answer to other things we didn't used to know. So I'd be really leery of using a word like being to frame an inquiry into the next thing we don't know. But having plentifully belabored that one word, let's look at these attributes he concludes it must have. Uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and unfathomably powerful. Now he's very sparing in arguing why it must have these attributes. In fact, the line of reasoning could be easy to miss, possibly by design. I see two things that contribute to this. 1. The reasoning comes before the traits. Instead of saying, the being must be uncaused, spaceless, and so on, then go on to say because of this and that explanation, he starts off by saying, as the cause of space and time it must be, then lists the traits and moves on. The first option gives you an assertion and then lets you consider it as the explanation is unfolding. In the second one, however, the explanation is all behind you by the time he makes the assertion, letting him blow through his list of traits and move on before you really have a chance to think about what he said. And 2, he never even explains why the cause of space and time must be all these things. He just says, as the cause of space and time, the being must be this list of traits, and acts like the reason is just self-evident. This works because it kind of seems right at first glance and he rushes it past us. But if you stop and look closely, it becomes clear how empty this drive-by appeal to our intuition really is. It largely relies on crudely formed opposites. The list includes a pair of words that are essentially the opposite of or defy our sense of time, and a pair of words that are the opposite of space and matter. Basically, because time and space can't go on forever, it seems that whatever caused it all must be something else. Now I can see how this seems to make sense, but the real conclusion we should take from this is that the universe exists because of something that's probably not space and time as we understand it, and in fact could be any number of things so mind-blowingly different from our intuitive concept of space and time that we're just taking shots in the dark if we try to deduce our way to it. In fact, notice I went out of my way to avoid language about something causing the universe, because even that wording brings intuition about causation into territory where it might not belong. But Craig just appeals to our intuition in terms of opposites. Where we should be saying, it's probably something other than space and time as we understand it, which blows the doors wide open to possibilities far outside our current vocabulary and conceptual framework, and leads us to the only reasonable conclusion, which is that we just don't know right now. Craig argues through implication, if it's not space it must be spaceless, if it's not time it must be timeless. These conclusions are still built on our intuition. And rather than acknowledging that the truth is probably beyond our vocabulary and framework, it pretends to deduce it's just some kind of intuitively accessible opposite of our current reality using our vocabulary and framework. This prompts the audience to connect the dots and start painting intuitive and likely dead wrong mental pictures of what spaceless and timeless probably mean. And since, let's not forget, this is apologetics, these mental pictures are going to start looking like God. He then throws in of unfathomable power, which feels right because the universe is so big and has so much stuff in it that what other than a being, oops, did I slip in a handy word there, with a lot of power could cause it. But even the word power as we understand it is used to describe physical objects acting on each other within the bounds of cause and effect. Or at the very least, that's the kind of image it puts in the audience's mind. So since whatever's behind the universe could be, and likely is, so far outside our understanding that it defies any concept likely to be put in our heads by a word like power, any conclusion that the universe must have come from something of unfathomable power is premature and honestly sounds juvenile. Anyway, let's get to his second contention.
Moreover, it must be personal as well. Why? Because the cause must be beyond space and time. Therefore, it cannot be physical or material. Now, there are only two kinds of things that fit that description. Either an abstract object, like numbers, or else a personal mind.
Okay, I need to pause him here for a second and ask, how does he know this? First off, how does he know that there's a clear divide between the material and the immaterial as we understand it? Maybe there are realities that defy our understanding of either category. But more than that, how the does he know that abstractions in the mind are the only two non-physical thing? This is just aggressively absurd. I mean, Christians themselves are the first to say that if there's an immaterial spiritual realm, it's far beyond our current understanding or even comprehension. Yet with all the possibilities of what might lie somewhere out there, Craig thinks he can deduce the only types of immaterial things that could possibly exist from his observations within the physical universe? The fact that he can get away with such an obviously unwarranted shortcut makes it clear that Christians are just letting him lead them to the conclusion they want to reach, with an unchecked willingness to overlook how he gets them there. And the fact that this hasn't disqualified him from being taken seriously by anybody ever speaks volumes.
But abstract objects can't cause anything. Therefore, it follows that the cause of the universe is a transcendent, intelligent mind.
First off, this whole argument is inconsequential because of the giant flying leap Craig took in narrowing non-material things down to abstract objects and minds. But even granting any validity to it, notice how he slipped in a sneaky distinction between abstract objects like numbers and personal minds, as if immaterial minds themselves are anything other than an abstraction. They aren't, at least in any demonstrable way Craig could use as a basis for an argument. And to see why, let's briefly look at what numbers are as an abstraction and alright, why they couldn't cause anything. Let's say there are two apples in front of you. In a material sense, the apples exist, and they're real things according to any useful standard. However, the only way the number 2 exists as an abstraction in this scenario is to the extent that I mentally categorize each apple as an individual object and use the word 2 to describe that grouping of them. Abstractions themselves do not exist except as a schema to help us organize the world around us. They're just a thought process. There's no 2 floating around out there, at least as far as we can demonstrate, and thus, like Craig said, as an abstraction it can't cause anything. So then let's look at the mind. Now, like apples, the brain exists in a real and material sense. The mind, however, does not exist except in the form of the brain and the neurological activity it produces. The consciousness that arises from this activity feels like something we call a mind, but as far as we can tell, it only exists to the extent that it's continuing to be generated by a working brain. If the brain is altered, the mind thinks differently. Once the brain is destroyed, then by all verifiable indications, what we call the mind is no longer there. Just like the idea of a number, the idea of a mind is just an abstraction we use to help describe and better understand something that only verifiably exists as a material reality. To the same extent that we can't demonstrate there are numbers floating around out there and have no good reason to think they are, we can't demonstrate there are minds floating around out there and have no good reason to think they are. And the only way a mind can be said to cause something is when the processes of a material brain prompt a material body to alter matter within a material world. That's literally all. Any idea of a mind doing anything other than that is just a paranormal assertion, not a demonstrated reality, and not a basis to start reasoning from. So Craig is really cutting corners when he distinguishes minds from abstractions, especially for the purpose of arguing that they float around in immaterial form, that they are the only things that float around in immaterial form, and thus that one of them must have created the universe. Seriously, the steps he tries to rush us through in arguing these points are even worse than the misleading lines of reasoning he uses in other ones. They're embarrassing non sequiturs. What's more, his reasoning is based on a flagrant double standard, because his deductions rely heavily on eliminating possibilities that don't fit within our body of daily observation. For example, we never see things happen without a cause, and so on. But then his conclusion is another thing that doesn't fit our daily observation. Because we never see anything in the neighborhood of disembodied minds, timeless beings, or anything like that. So his reasoning is basically, this thing isn't possible because it appears to contradict intuitive observed reality, therefore the only explanation is this other thing that appears to contradict intuitive observed reality. The difference, and pay attention because this is key, is that one of the things is part of a religion he's setting out from the start to justify, and the other is not. And that should tell us everything we need to know about William Lane Craig. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, A Little Logic, Daniel Bostet, Nidemos, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.